So you have now completed your table of specification activity. We're going to go on to the different test characteristics. What and how to measure will be addressed by table of specifications. When to test. How do we know when to test? Well, you want to test frequently enough so that you get reliable results, but not so frequently that you needlessly use or waste instructional time. You need to make sure that you budget enough time for the test that you're giving. This is very important, especially as new teachers. We tend to underestimate the time that our students are going to need for tests. So you need to make sure that you are planning accordingly and that your test is the appropriate number of questions and type of questions that can be conducted in one class period. Well, how many questions should we have on the test? Generally, the reliability of an achievement test increases with the length of the test, but you still need to consider the time available for testing. So just like I said, if you have 1 hour, then you need to create a test that can be finished in 1 hour. So this is going to take into consideration the type of the type of questions that could be used and the attention span of your students. So high school students could usually answer about 3 true-false questions, 3 matching, or 1 or 2 complete fill-in-the-blank questions within 1 minute of time. However, it's going to take younger children a lot more time to answer those types of questions. Essay questions are going to vary dramatically in general because there's short essay questions and longer essay questions. And depending on the type of essay question that you're giving will depend on the length of time that you want to give for those essay questions. It's best if you only give 1 or 2 full essay questions for an exam. Teachers often wonder what type of test format should be used. The most common and efficient method is written with each student getting their own copy of the test. Well, what type of questions should be used on the test? Determining whether to use objective, semi-objective, or essay questions given the amount of time available to take the test and to score it is usually how you're going to decide that. So just like we talked about in the last slide, the time for the test is really going to dictate the type of questions that you're asking. Regardless of the question type, it's important to reduce the amount of subjectivity involved in the question development, and scoring will in turn increase the reliability of the test. Regardless of the types of questions that you're going to use on the test, the usefulness of the resulting score depends on its stability or its reliability. The test should be designed to measure achievement on certain objectives, and as such, the resulting scores should express the degree of achievement, so your test should be stable from class section to class section and from semester to semester. Given that you have not changed the instruction, the objectives have not changed. So here's some general recommendations for creating tests. When using multiple types of questions, you need to group the questions by type. So all true, false should be together, and then all multiple choice should be together. You need to group together questions of similar content. You need to make sure that you're considering have the first 2 or so questions on a test be easier to reduce test anxiety of students. So you don't want to start out with hard questions because it could lead to a student giving up before they've even really started the test. So try to ease into your hard questions so that students aren't giving up too easily and thinking that they're going to do bad on the test. This causes anxiety and could cause them to do bad on the entire test. Discuss open notes. So you need to make sure that your you need to make sure that you're discussing with your students whether it's going to be an open note test, whether they're allowed to have a a flashcard, or if the test is going to be a take-home format. So you discuss this with your students, and then it's also important that you understand that the type of tests, the questions that you give on those types of tests are different. So an open note test requires more developed tests with more application and higher order questions, but fewer questions overall, as they take longer than closed book exams. If you have a take-home format, it's important to understand that you still want to use those higher level questions, but you could make the exam a little bit longer. You need to make sure that before you start a new test section for written tests, that you begin with clear instructions for the new section. So if you're moving from a multiple choice question to a true-false, there needs to be new instructions for each. For example, the book said that for true-false, and we're going to talk about this in a second, you need to correct the false statements. So you would make sure that you give those specific directions right before the true-false section. Provide adequate space for students to respond. So if you're using essay questions or short answer, you need to make sure that you provide enough space for the students to respond. And it's always good to give them extra paper just in case. It's also good to avoid splitting items between pages. So if students decide that, if you have a question that overlaps on 2 pages, it's usually better if you put that question on the second page instead of having it split between 2. Most of the time this causes confusion with the students, and sometimes they end up missing a test question. So for true-false questions, you want to avoid using an item whose truth or false hinges on one insignificant word or phrase. You don't want to use indefinite word phrases. You don't want to quote lecture notes or book references directly. You don't want to use clues embedded within the question. You want to make sure that you don't have any double negatives. You want to make sure that you have more than one topic, that you don't have more than one topic per statement. And you want to make sure that there's no particular patterns within the response, such as true, true, false, false, true, true, false, false. It's also important to understand the length of true-false questions should be about the same. So don't always make your false sentences longer, or don't always make your true sentences longer. You need to make sure that they're equivalent. You also want to keep the number of responses balanced, so 50% true and 50% false, or slightly in favor of false responses, as unprepared students are more inclined to mark true more often than false. You also need to make sure that the statements that you're putting on the test are absolutely false or absolutely true, meaning in no condition could they be the other. Know that true-false questions are easy to construct and score, but they're very limited in their ability to measure achievement, as there's a 50% chance that students can guess on the question and get the right answer. So if using a true-false question, it's important that you make your students correct the false statements. So next we're going to talk about matching questions. So matching can be effectively used to measure who, what, where, or when, but not how or why. So this is going to be limited to knowledge or remembering level questions within our Bloom's taxonomy. Matching questions are also very easy to construct and score, but in general, we need to make sure that we're following the following rules. You need to provide clear directions, including the basis for matching the items, how to report the answers, and whether a response can be used more than once. You want to make sure that you avoid providing clues by having all words and phrases in one column be logical and grammatically acceptable to every question in other columns. You want to avoid too many questions in one matching item. You want to make sure that you construct matching items with lists of questions and answers that are homogeneous in nature. Consider including more answers than questions to remove the possibility of process of elimination. It's important to arrange the two lists of questions and answers in a logical order, such as alphabetical or chronological. Make scoring easy for yourself by having all blanks on the left-hand margin. So the book went into detail about this, of what should be on the left and what should be on the right. And then they also talked about using capital letters for your choices, because capital letters are harder to misinterpret, such as C and E, than lowercase letters. And then the last thing is to make sure that the group answers and stems into separate parts. So for multiple choice questions, the book says that you should have no less than 4 responses to each stem. A stem is the main sentence of the multiple choice. So you would start out with whatever the question is, and then you would list 4 answers. Multiple choice are perceived to be the best types of questions to use on the test. Multiple choice is chosen by major test developers, and therefore they are deemed one of the most valid and reliable types of questions. They can measure higher order cognitive processes such as application and analysis. Multiple choice questions tend to be less ambiguous than other forms of questions, and they're less susceptible to blind guessing or correct responses by chance. They can also measure almost any educational objective, so multiple choice questions are very versatile. In general, here's a couple of things to keep in mind. Make sure you use multiple choice questions to evaluate understanding of principles and generalizations rather than facts and details. Use novel situations rather than examples from class. Avoid using direct phrases from the text or notes. Avoid negatively stated questions. Those just confuse students. Draft the stem, so the main part of the question, as a direct question or as an incomplete sentence. Carefully construct your key correct response and distractors so that they are grammatically correct and plausible for the given stem. Your answers should avoid the use of repetitive phrases, and they should also avoid the use of all of the above or none of the above. There really is nothing magical about having 4 or 5 choices, but make sure that you're offering good choices. Don't add unreasonable choices that should not be selected, as these stick out easily to your students. So it's important that when we talk about our choices, we think about extrinsic versus intrinsic ambiguity. So when we think about ambiguity, we're thinking about obvious or not so obvious answers. So in this situation, item A is our correct answer. You want test items to appear ambiguous to those students who do not understand the concept. So you want them to appear close to the other answers. However, you do not want the items to appear ambiguous to those students who do understand the concept. So you don't want them so close that they all could be the answer. And then you don't want to make the other questions or the other answers too easy. So essentially, we want them extrinsically ambiguous. We want it so that A is the right answer, and C, D, and B are going to be very similar to them. All right, so next we're going to talk about semi-objective questions. So these are short answer completion questions and mathematical problems. So these are going to be used for measuring relatively factual information such as vocab, dates, names, ideas of concept, and mathematical principles. They're really simple to construct and score. They almost eliminate the possibility of guessing the correct answer. And they often require additional information and prompts so that the STEM is not ambiguous. For example, basketball was invented by, and they have to provide the person's name. In general, the book provides you a whole list of things that you need to avoid. So avoid or modify indefinite statements. Construct incomplete sentences where the blanks occur near the end of the sentence. Do not construct sentences with so many blanks that the statement becomes indefinite or ambiguous. Avoid copying sentences verbatim from the book or notes. The blank should be for important words that have been omitted. Do not give inadvertent clues, such as longer or shorter spaces for responses or limiting verbs or articles. If a numerical response is required, indicate the units and the degree of accuracy desired. Use short answer questions when possible to avoid ambiguous completion statements. The last type of question we're going to talk about is an essay question. So essay questions can require students to provide interpretations, compare, contrast, demonstrate their knowledge of something, and it's used, there's various other uses for it. Within Bloom's taxonomy, you're looking at essay questions to organize, analyze, synthesize, and evaluate. For the response to an essay question to be scored accurately, the evaluator or the teacher must be knowledgeable about the topic being assessed and clear in their delineation of what is an acceptable answer. For me, it's always important that when I write the essay question, I know how many points that essay question is going to be worth, and I know how I got to that point total before I even give the students a test. The use of essays can limit ability to obtain a wide sample of achievement, as time and effort put into responses limits breadth of content able to be evaluated. One of the most serious issues with essay questions is the scoring. Issues of reliability related to subjective interpretation of response by the teacher, along with generalizations about the person rather than the responses, handwriting, grammar, etc., all could be calculated into the scoring. And you want to make sure that as a teacher, you're being as objective as possible and not counting out for those things. You want to construct the question so that the mental process you desire the student to employ is very clear. It's better to construct essay questions that require relatively short responses rather than one or two lengthy response essay questions. Make sure that you phrase the question so that it's task specified. So use words like explain, compare, present arguments for, rather than what do you think of, or write all you know about something. Specify the desired length of the essay, the time limit that they have to complete, and the evaluative criteria. So for example, if you want them to identify 2 of 3 factors and limit your response to 2 pages. Make sure that you draft a model response in at least an outline format and include that in your content for scoring ease. So as you're scoring, you can go back and refer to that document. Avoid giving a choice of essay questions to be answered. If an essay test is designed to measure achievement of objectives in a group of students, all exposed to the same information, then the students should all be required to answer the same questions. The common base of measurement is lost if a choice of questions is given. So a couple of last minute things to think about. Before administering a test, you should always prepare your students. Make sure that you construct good test questions. Make sure you give lengthy instructions before the test. You also need to proofread the test. And if you can give a study guide or a practice test to your students beforehand, that's always helpful. During the test, you want to make sure that you efficiently distribute and collect tests so that no student has an unfair advantage. Help your testees or your examinees pace themselves, so let them know how much time is left in the class. Answer questions individually, and if you feel that you need to bring something up to the entire class, then do so immediately. Prevent cheating by walking around, being an active participant in their test taking. And make sure that you're controlling the environment so that there's not a lot of noise, the lighting is okay, the temperature in the room is good enough for testing, etc. Once the test is complete, it's really important that you correct and report scores promptly. Reporting scores anonymously is always the best thing to do. You never want to post your grades. And make sure that you avoid misusing or misinterpreting scores.